So first of all, I should say that I'm doing this without the benefit of Sharon Potter's wisdom. Sharon is on sabbatical, and you'll remember that Sharon has been our lead on the diocese's engagement with living in love and faith. But you'll recall from last synod that we set up a group to look at how the diocese might respond to and engage with the next steps at the end of the living in love and faith process, trying to discern what God might be calling us to in Suffolk, and to do that, as it were, alongside and in reflection upon what's been going on in the national process. I want to report on that group, although we've only had one meeting, but I thought it might be helpful just to start by saying something about what happened at the Lambeth conference, and not least because of the misleading press coverage that the section on sexuality received. There were, as you know, 700 bishops present from around the world, although most bishops from Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda chose not to attend because of their opposition to any acceptance of homosexual relationships. Having said that, we also must not assume that those are monolithic provinces. There is a lot of variation of views within those provinces. So we're not talking about solid blocks, as it were. Among the 700 who did attend were a number who were also concerned by the presence of bishops who are gay, and in some cases in partnerships. And the bishops from one province, at least, so South Sudan, declared that they wouldn't receive communion. So you can imagine this was already a tense conference, not least because of the concern that the Anglican communion could fall apart over this. The tension was compounded with the publication of the so-called calls, which were the statements that had been produced by a whole range of groups over a good period of time, which were meant to be the focus of our discussion on a whole range of issues, which included the environment and mission and evangelism, science, and so forth. And the particular call on human dignity, which considered sexuality as well as slavery and abuse and other areas where people's dignity was clearly or potentially demeaned, in its final form of that call, or what was intended to be the final form, there was a statement reaffirming the declaration from the 1998 Lambeth Conference, and the declaration known as Lambeth 110, that same-sex marriage was not possible. That produced a furious response from many, including many English bishops, and the wording of the call was then amended to state, and I'm just reading from it, many provinces continue to affirm that same-gender marriage is not permissible. Other provinces have blessed and welcomed same-sex union or marriage after careful theological reflection and a process of reception. As bishops, we remain committed to listening and walking together to the maximum possible degree, despite our deep disagreements on these issues. However, while the wording was broadly welcomed, it didn't calm the febrile atmosphere. And I recall a conversation I had with a bishop just before we sat down to discuss this particular call, where he and I agreed that the conference and potentially the communion could all be about to fall apart. It was Archbishop Justin's remarkable and powerful speech that dramatically changed that, and not just averted disaster, but made us, I believe, as a communion stronger. It's worth reading both the letter that he published at that point and his speech. Let me just take a few points from the speech. He said, and I quote, "For the large majority of the Anglican communion, the traditional understanding of marriage is something that is understood, accepted, and without question, not only by bishops, but their entire church and the societies in which they live. For them, to question this teaching is unthinkable, and in many countries would make the church a victim of derision, contempt, or even attack. For many churches, to change traditional teaching challenges their very existence." And then he went on to say, for a minority, we can say almost the same. They have not arrived lightly at their ideas that traditional teaching needs to change. They are not careless about scripture. They do not reject Christ, but they have come to a different view on sexuality after long prayer, deep study, and reflection on understandings of human nature. For them to question this different teaching is unthinkable, and in many countries is making the church a victim of derision, contempt, and even attack. For these churches not to change traditional teaching challenges their very existence. Now, in making these statements, Justin was describing the reality of the situation across the communion and ascribing to both positions faithfulness to Christ and to Scripture. That was a huge step, simply and powerfully to acknowledge that many of us experience and understand as the reality. Division exists and is deep, but it is between profoundly faithful people. And what is more, he went on to say, I, Justin, neither have nor do I seek the authority to discipline or exclude a church of the Anglican Communion. I will not do so. And by saying that, he indicated that from his point of view, the days of putting a church like the Episcopal Church of the United States, as it were, onto the naughty step, those days were over. The reaction to this speech, which was fundamentally a description of where we are, was profound. Justin received a standing ovation. The atmosphere relaxed dramatically so that we were then able to actually engage fully with the whole range of issues we were thinking about in the 2 weeks that we spent together. And along the way, conversations on the side with bishops from traditionally conservative contexts being able to say, no, as I indicated earlier, the picture in my context is more complex than you might realize. Above all, the communion, accepting that some had chosen to be absent, the communion, as represented by those present, was intact, and indeed not just intact, but as I said, stronger, because it was built on human relationships between followers of Jesus Christ, not on whether you signed up to this position or that position on this issue or that. It became gospel, love one another as I have loved you. I should just add that one of the stars in this whole exercise was Bishop Mike, who was given the impossible job of comparing the plenary discussions of these various calls, and made the more impossible because the rules about how they were going to be conducted were being changed every time that we met. And he, with Bishop Rose from Kenya, managed to steer us through these discussions in the most, as you can imagine, the most brilliant and clear way. Let me finally return to our diocesan group. The group has met once, quite recently, after what had been scheduled to be the first meeting of the College of Bishops to discuss the Living in Love and Faith process. There were to be 3 residential meetings of the College of Bishops this autumn, just to talk about LLF and the next steps. The first, though, was cancelled because of the death of Her Majesty. Our group, our little group, met this last week anyway, and had a helpful conversation to set a sort of framework for further conversations. The group comprises Tifa Robinson, Tony Allwood, Sharon Potter, Jonathan Alden Ford, Joe Hayes, and Mary Hare. Sharon and Mary couldn't make this first meeting. Out of that meeting, following on from the experience of the Lambeth Conference, came the shared view of all of us there that what we need to be doing is seeking a way of generous accommodation between different profoundly and faithfully held positions so that we can be true to those positions while holding together as one body. Thank you very much.